The sledgehammer came down hard against the plaster, and Marcus Chen felt the wall give way in a way that walls shouldn't. Not a clean break through drywall and studs, but something hollow, something that exhaled dust like a held breath finally released. He pulled back, sweat already soaking through his shirt, despite the October chill seeping through the old Victorian's broken windows, and stared at the darkness beyond the hole he'd just created. Something was wrong. The space behind this wall wasn't supposed to exist. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus had been swinging hammers for 16 years, ever since he'd walked away from his father's engineering firm in Seattle and decided that working with his hands meant more than pushing numbers across spreadsheets that would be forgotten by morning. He'd restored Craftsman bungalows in Portland, rebuilt farmhouses in rural Oregon, and spent 3 winters in Montana bringing century-old barns back from the edge of collapse. He knew how buildings spoke when you listened carefully enough. He understood the language of settling foundations, the grammar of water damage, the vocabulary of time pulling everything slowly toward the earth. But this house, the Mercer place, had been lying to him from the moment he'd walked through its front door 6 weeks ago. The property sat 3 miles outside the town of Ridgemont, Washington, population 2,847, the kind of place where everyone knew your grandmother's maiden name and could tell you which corner of which field your great-grandfather had cleared in 1903. The house itself had been built in 1889 by Clayton Mercer, a timber baron who'd made his fortune when the forest seemed endless and the railroad was hungry for wood. 3 stories of Victorian ambition, wrapped in gingerbread trim that had survived 100 winters but was now surrendering to gravity and neglect. The property had been vacant for 7 years, ever since the last Mercer heir, an elderly woman named Catherine, had been moved to a care facility in Spokane. Her nephew, a software executive in California who'd never set foot in Ridgemont, had hired Marcus to make the place sellable, gut the interior if needed, replace what couldn't be saved. Just make it look like something besides the town's most elegant ghost. Marcus stepped closer to the hole, his flashlight cutting through the darkness beyond. The space was maybe 4 feet wide, running parallel to the second-floor hallway. Not a gap between walls created by careless framing, but a deliberate room, sealed off so completely that no door had ever interrupted the hallway's smooth plaster surface. Whoever had closed this space had wanted it forgotten. The air that drifted out carried the scent of old paper and something else, something organic and faintly sweet in a way that made his stomach tighten with instinctive unease. He'd smelled that particular combination before, in a foreclosed farmhouse outside Eugene, where the previous owner had died alone and undiscovered for 3 weeks during a July heatwave. The thought of what might be waiting in this sealed darkness made him pull back from the opening, his hand already reaching for his phone before his conscious mind had decided to call anyone. But curiosity, that professional need to understand what he was dealing with, made him widen the hole before making any calls. 3 more swings with the sledgehammer, and the opening was large enough to step through. His flashlight revealed a narrow room, barely wide enough for a person to stand with arms outstretched, stretching maybe 20 feet along the hallway's length. The floor was the same rough-cut fur that ran throughout the rest of the house, the walls unfinished studs and horsehair plaster. And covering nearly every surface, stacked on shelves that had been hastily constructed from scrap lumber, piled on the floor in boxes that had split open with age, were journals. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Leather-bound books with water-stained covers, composition notebooks with pages yellowed to the color of old bone, loose papers bundled with twine that had rotted until it barely held together. Marcus stepped into the room carefully, testing each floorboard before committing his weight, and picked up the nearest journal. The leather cover crumbled slightly under his fingers, releasing more of that papery dust smell that mixed with the room's stale air. He opened it carefully, tilting his flashlight to read the cramped handwriting that covered the pages in lines so dense they barely left margins. The 17th of August, 1934. Father's cough worsened through the night. Mother insists it's merely the dust from threshing, but I've heard that sound before. Consumption took Uncle Wesley the same way, starting with a cough that seemed ordinary until suddenly it wasn't. I find myself lying awake, counting his breaths through the thin walls, wondering if each one might be the last. The land cares nothing for our struggles. The wheat grew well this year despite everything, golden and heavy, bending under its own abundance. But what does abundance matter if there's no one left to harvest it? Marcus turned the page, his hands moving with the automatic gentleness that years of handling old materials had taught him. The entries continued day after day, the handwriting sometimes neat and controlled, other times sprawling and barely legible, as if written in darkness or great haste. The voice belonged to someone named Eleanor, though no last name appeared in this early section. She wrote about farm work and weather, about neighbors whose names meant nothing to Marcus, but who clearly formed the entire universe of this writer's daily existence. She wrote about her father's failing health and her mother's silent grief, about a brother who'd left for Seattle and never sent letters home, about a young man named Thomas who'd started finding excuses to help with their haying, even though his own family's farm was struggling. There was something hypnotic about the voice, the way it captured the weight of days that must have felt both eternal and desperately finite to the person living them. Marcus found himself reading entry after entry, turning pages that released small puffs of decay into the flashlight beam, until he realized 20 minutes had passed and he'd barely moved from his position just inside the hidden room's entrance. He forced himself to close the journal and set it carefully on the nearest shelf, then directed his flashlight toward the back of the space, trying to gauge the full scope of what he'd discovered. The room extended the entire length of the hallway, and the journals covered every available surface. Some were organized on shelves with a precision that suggested careful curation. Others were piled haphazardly, as if they'd been added hastily when storage space became scarce. Near the back wall, Marcus could see several wooden crates, the kind that might have held apples or vegetables a century ago, now repurposed as storage containers for papers that had overflowed the available shelf space. The sheer volume of writing represented in this sealed room suggested decades of obsessive documentation, someone's entire life translated into thousands of pages of handwritten text. Marcus pulled out his phone, checked the time, and saw it was already past 4. The October light was failing fast this far north, and the house had no working electricity yet. He needed to make decisions about what he'd found, but first, he needed to understand the basic parameters of the situation. He moved carefully through the hidden room, stepping over stacks of journals, examining the shelves and their contents with his flashlight. Some journals bore dates on their spines, creating a timeline that stretched from the early 1930 seconds to what looked like the late 1970 seconds. 40-some years of daily life, documented with a detail and consistency that bordered on compulsive. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Near the room's midpoint, Marcus found something that made him stop completely. A journal that had been set apart from the others, placed on a small shelf at eye level where it would be immediately visible to anyone who entered this space. Unlike the other volumes with their worn leather covers and water-stained pages, this one was wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved it almost perfectly. Marcus lifted it carefully, unwrapped the protective covering, and found a letter tucked inside the front cover. The paper was thick and expensive, the kind that spoke of formal occasions and serious intent. The handwriting was shaky but still legible, clearly written by someone whose hands no longer entirely to obeyed their will. To whoever finds this room, I pray you understand what you're holding. These journals contain the truth about what happened to the Holloway family in 1947, a truth that this town has spent 70 years trying to forget. My mother, Eleanor Mercer, born Eleanor Holloway, witnessed something that haunted her until the day she died. She wrote it all down, documented every detail, every conversation, every moment of that terrible summer when 5 people disappeared and everyone in Ridgemont decided it was easier to look away than to ask why. The official story is comfortable and clean. The truth is buried in these pages, and I'm too old now to fight the battle that revealing it would require. But someone should know. Someone should carry this forward. The dead deserve better than our convenient amnesia. The letter was signed Catherine Mercer, dated March 2017, just months before she'd been moved to the care facility. Marcus read it twice, trying to process the implications, then carefully opened the journal that the letter had protected. The first entry was dated the 1st of June 1947, and the handwriting, though older and more assured than in the journals from the 1,930 seconds, was clearly the same person. Eleanor, the farm girl who'd written about her father's cough and Thomas's attention, now a woman in her 30s writing about something that required a special journal, set apart from the daily documentation of ordinary life. They're saying the Holloway place burned in an accident, that James must have knocked over a lantern and the whole family was lost before anyone could help. The sheriff drove out this morning to confirm what the volunteer fire brigade had already reported. Foundations still smoking, nothing left but blackened timber and ash, 5 bodies so badly burned they could barely be identified. The town is organizing a memorial service, collecting money for a proper burial. Everyone's talking about what a tragedy it is, how James Holloway was such a good man, how Sarah kept the finest garden in the county, how those 3 children had their whole lives ahead of them. But I was there 2 nights before the fire. I saw what I saw, heard what I heard, and I know that what happened at the Holloway farm wasn't any accident. Marcus felt the temperature in the room drop, or perhaps it was just his skin responding to the words he was reading. He continued through the entry, his flashlight steady despite the way his hands wanted to shake. Eleanor wrote about driving past the Holloway property on her way home from a neighbor's house, about seeing vehicles parked in the yard despite the late hour, about hearing raised voices and deciding to pull off the road and wait because something felt wrong. She described seeing James Holloway arguing with 3 men she didn't recognize, their city clothes and aggressive postures out of place in the rural setting. She wrote about hearing fragments of conversation carried on the night wind, words like payment and consequences and your family better understand. The entry continued for pages, detailing how Eleanor had watched from her concealed position in the roadside brush, how she'd seen money change hands, how the argument had escalated until one of the city men had struck James hard enough to knock him down. She described how James's wife Sarah had come out of the house and been roughly pushed back inside, how the children's faces had appeared briefly at an upstairs window before someone pulled them away. And she wrote about how 2 nights later, when the fire call went out and the whole community rushed to help, she'd known immediately that this was no accident, that the Holloway family had been silenced for knowing something or owing something or refusing something that powerful men couldn't tolerate. Marcus closed the journal carefully and stood in the darkness of the hidden room, trying to steady his breathing. Around him, the journals waited like witnesses who'd been kept from testifying, their combined weight representing decades of Eleanor Mercer's desperate need to document truth in a world that preferred comfortable fictions. The house creaked and settled around him, the old wood responding to temperature changes, but the sounds felt different now, less like the ordinary voices of an aging structure and more like whispers demanding attention. He thought about Catherine Mercer, spending her final months in this house, sealing her mother's lifetime of documentation into a hidden room rather than destroying it or bringing it forward. Choosing preservation over revelation, protecting truth while also containing it, leaving it for someone else to decide what should be done. The weight of that decision now sat in Marcus's hands, and he understood with sudden clarity that he'd stopped being just a contractor the moment his sledgehammer had broken through that wall. The light from his phone screen cast his shadow long across the journal-covered shelves, and Marcus realized he was standing at the kind of crossroads that defined who you were when the easy path and the right path diverged completely. He could seal the wall back up, finish the renovation, take his payment, and walk away, leaving Eleanor Mercer's testimony to continue its silent witness in darkness. Or he could make the call that would turn a simple renovation project into something far more complicated, that would bring questions and attention and complications to a job that was supposed to be straightforward. His father's voice echoed in his memory, words from one of their last arguments before Marcus had left Seattle, something about how running away to swing hammers was just another form of avoiding responsibility, of choosing the simple over the significant. Marcus had spent 16 years proving his father wrong, demonstrating that there was dignity and purpose in restoration work, that bringing old structures back from ruin mattered in ways that engineering, contracts and profit margins never would. But standing in this hidden room, surrounded by evidence of carefully buried truth, he wondered if his father had been right after all, if he'd been choosing work that let him avoid the kind of complications that required more than skilled hands and good intentions. The journal in his hands felt heavier than its physical weight, loaded with the responsibility of all the words Eleanor Mercer had carefully preserved, all the truth Catherine Mercer had chosen to hide rather than bring forward. Marcus thought about the Holloway family, 5 people reduced to a sad story the town had learned to tell without ever questioning the official narrative. He thought about Eleanor, spending 40 years documenting a truth no one wanted to hear, creating an archive of witness that her own daughter had sealed away rather than defended. Outside, the October wind picked up, rattling the Victorian's loose windows and sending leaves scraping across the wraparound porch. The sound was like whispers or warnings, like the house itself trying to tell him something about the nature of the choice he was about to make. Marcus carefully rewrapped the special journal in its oilcloth protection and set it back on its shelf, then made his way out of the hidden room and down the hallway to where he'd left his tools and his water bottle and his phone, with its decision waiting to be made. The hole in the wall gaped like an open mouth, exhaling its secrets into the ordinary air of a house that had spent decades keeping those secrets contained. Marcus pulled out his phone again, scrolled through his contacts to the number for Tom Brennan, the contractor who'd hired him for this job and who had family connections to Ridgemont going back 4 generations. Tom would know what this discovery meant, would understand the complications that were about to unfold if Marcus made this official. But calling Tom meant staying within the town's established patterns, trusting that local knowledge and local discretion would handle things appropriately. The other option was the number he'd saved but never expected to use, Detective Sarah Warren with the Washington State Police, someone he'd met 2 years ago during the investigation of human remains found in a property he'd been renovating outside Olympia. She'd given him her card, told him that contractors working on old properties sometimes stumbled into situations that needed official attention, that knowing when to make that call was part of taking the work seriously. Marcus had kept the card more out of politeness than any expectation he'd need it, but now he found himself pulling it from his wallet, the paper slightly worn from 2 years of being carried, but the numbers still clearly legible. He stood in the hallway with his phone in one hand and the detective's card in the other, the weight of the decision pressing down like the accumulation of all those years Eleanor Mercer had spent writing truth that no one would read. The house waited around him, patient and knowing, having held its secrets this long, with the expectation that eventually someone would decide whether those secrets deserved light or deeper darkness. Through the windows, Marcus could see the October sun dropping toward the tree line, painting the sky in shades that spoke of endings and transitions, of day surrendering to night the way truth sometimes surrendered to convenience. The choice he made in the next 60 seconds would determine whether Eleanor Mercer's testimony finally found its audience or whether her daughter's decision to seal truth away would be the final word on what happened to the Holloway family in the summer of 1947. Marcus looked at the phone, looked at the detective's card, looked back at the hole in the wall where decades of documented witness waited in darkness, and felt the full weight of what it meant to be the person who'd broken through to truth, whether truth wanted to be found or not. Marcus made the call to Detective Warren at 4:47 p.m., his voice steady despite the way his pulse hammered against his throat. She answered on the third ring, her tone professional but not unfriendly, and he could hear the background noise of a busy office, phones ringing and voices overlapping in the practiced chaos of law enforcement work winding down toward evening. He explained what he'd found in 3 careful sentences, keeping his language precise and factual, describing the hidden room and the journals and the letter from Catherine Mercer without editorializing about what any of it might mean. When he finished, there was a pause long enough that he wondered if the connection had dropped. Then Detective Warren's voice came back different, sharper, with the kind of focus that meant she understood immediately that this wasn't a routine call about old papers and dusty discoveries. She told him not to touch anything else, not to let anyone into the property, and that she'd be there within 2 hours. The drive from Olympia to Ridgemont would normally take closer to 3, but Marcus recognized the tone of someone who intended to make that journey faster than traffic laws strictly permitted. After they hung up, he stood in the hallway for several minutes, phone still in his hand, wondering if he'd just made the right choice or the kind of mistake that looked like integrity until you understood all the ways it would complicate everything that came after. The October light was failing fast now, the sun dropping behind the tree line and taking with it the last warmth of the afternoon. Marcus went downstairs to his truck and retrieved the battery-powered work lights he'd been using since the house had no electricity, setting them up in the second-floor hallway so the hidden room wouldn't be lost to darkness before the detective arrived. As he worked, positioning lights and running extension cords to his portable generator, he found his mind circling back to Eleanor. Mercer's words, the careful documentation of that night when she'd witnessed something that contradicted the comfortable story the town had learned to tell itself. He thought about small towns and the way they protected their own narratives, how communities built consensus around versions of events that allowed everyone to sleep soundly rather than wrestle with complications that had no clean resolution. Growing up in Seattle, Marcus had always imagined rural places as somehow more honest, less caught up in the performance and pretense that urban life seemed to require. But 16 years of restoration work in small towns across the Pacific Northwest had taught him that every community, regardless of size, developed its own carefully maintained fictions, stories everyone agreed to believe because the alternative required admitting that terrible things could happen and go unpunished, that justice was sometimes just another word for whatever the powerful decided they could live with. At 5:30, as Marcus sat on the porch steps eating a cold sandwich from his cooler and watching the last light drain from the sky, a white pickup pulled into the driveway with Tom Brennan behind the wheel. Tom was 52, a contractor who'd inherited his father's business and his grandfather's reputation, someone whose handshake still meant something in a world where contracts were increasingly thick with legal protections and escape clauses. He'd given Marcus steady work for the past 3 years, recommended him to clients throughout the county, treated him with the kind of respect that had become rare in an industry increasingly dominated by corporate flippers and investment syndicates. Seeing Tom's truck appear now, unannounced and unexpected, made Marcus's stomach tighten with the certainty that news traveled fast in Ridgemont, faster than anyone had officially been told anything. Tom got out of his truck, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd spent 40 years framing houses and knew his knees wouldn't tolerate hurried movements anymore. He was wearing canvas work pants and a fleece jacket, his grey hair pushed back under a Carhartt cap that had seen better decades. He didn't say anything immediately, just stood there in the driveway looking at the Victorian's facade like he was seeing it for the first time. Or maybe like he was seeing too many memories layered over the present structure. "Heard you found something interesting up there," Tom said finally, his voice carrying the flat effect that people used when they were working hard not to show what they were actually feeling. "Word gets around." Marcus set down his sandwich, no longer hungry despite having skipped lunch. "Who told you? Does it matter?" Tom climbed the porch steps slowly, each one creaking under his weight in a way Marcus had been meaning to repair but hadn't gotten to yet. Small town, Marcus. Someone sees a Seattle contractor making calls to state police about the Mercer place. That information makes the rounds faster than you'd think possible. Question is, what exactly did you find that couldn't be handled locally? There was no accusation in Tom's voice. Not exactly, but there was something harder than disappointment, a kind of careful neutrality that felt more dangerous than direct anger. Marcus stood up, meeting Tom's eyes, and finding there the complicated mix of loyalty and warning that came from someone who genuinely liked you, but had other allegiances that ran deeper than friendship. Hidden room, sealed up behind the hallway wall, Marcus said, keeping his voice level. Full of journals, decades worth. Eleanor Mercer documented something that happened in 1947, something about a family named Holloway, and a fire that maybe wasn't what everyone said it was. Tom's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of recognition or resignation that confirmed he knew exactly what Marcus was talking about. He lowered himself onto the porch railing, the old wood groaning under his weight, and was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the darkening landscape where the tree line merged with sky. My grandfather knew the Holloways, Tom said eventually. Helped build their barn in '44, did carpentry work on their house the following spring. Good people, he always said, though he never talked much about what happened to them. Just said it was a terrible tragedy and left it at that. My father was 16 when the fire happened, old enough to volunteer with the brigade that went out there, and he came home different that night. Wouldn't talk about what he'd seen, wouldn't even let us mention the Holloway name at the dinner table. Some things, Marcus, they get buried for a reason. Because they're too painful or because they're too true. Marcus heard the edge in his own voice and tried to soften it. Tom, there's a letter from Catherine Mercer saying her mother witnessed something that contradicted the official story. That's not small-town gossip or old grievances, that's documented testimony from someone who saw what happened. Tom turned to look at him directly, and the sadness in his face was profound enough to make Marcus wish he'd handled this entire situation differently. You ever wonder why Catherine sealed that room instead of bringing it forward? She was a smart woman, taught history at the high school for 30 years, spent her whole life in this town. She could have made noise about whatever's in those journals any time she wanted, could have demanded investigations or written to newspapers or caused all kinds of trouble. But she chose to seal it up, Marcus. She chose to let sleeping dogs lie because she understood something you're about to learn the hard way. Which is what? Exactly. Marcus felt his defensive instincts rising, the part of him that had always bristled when people suggested that avoiding complications was somehow wiser than facing them. That some truths don't heal old wounds, they just open new ones, Tom said quietly. That there are people in this town whose grandfathers or great-uncles were probably involved in whatever happened at the Holloway place, people who've built decent lives and raised good families without ever knowing their ancestors might have done something terrible. You bring that forward now, 77 years later, everyone who could be prosecuted is long dead, but their descendants get to carry the weight of it. Is that justice, Marcus? Or is it just spreading old pain around to new people? The argument had a kind of logic that made Marcus uncomfortable because he couldn't immediately dismiss it. He thought about the families in Ridgemont, the interconnected web of relationships and histories that stretched back generations, everyone related to everyone else through marriage or blood or shared experience. Exploding a story the town had lived with peacefully for nearly 8 decades would send shrapnel through all those connections, forcing people to reassess family legends and question inheritances, both literal and moral. But then he thought about the Holloway family, 5 people whose deaths had been explained away with a convenient fiction, whose truth had been sealed in darkness because revealing it would complicate too many comfortable narratives. He thought about Eleanor Mercer, spending 40 years documenting what she'd witnessed because some part of her believed that truth mattered even when it was inconvenient, that the dead deserved better than expedient amnesia. "The detective is already on her way," Marcus said, which wasn't an answer to Tom's question but was the only response he could offer that felt honest. "I made the call. Whatever happens now happens." Tom nodded slowly, like he'd expected this answer even if he'd hoped for a different one. "Figured as much. You're a good contractor, Marcus. Maybe the best I've worked with in 20 years. But you're not from here, and you don't understand how places like Ridgemont work, how the past and present are all mixed up together in ways that don't make sense to outsiders. When that detective shows up and starts asking questions, when the story gets out and people start choosing sides, you're going to see a version of this town you didn't know existed. And when the job is over and you drive away, we're the ones who have to keep living with whatever mess gets made." The implicit warning was clear enough, and Marcus felt the professional relationship he'd built with Tom beginning to fracture under the weight of competing loyalties. "If I'd found human remains, you'd expect me to call authorities. If I'd found evidence of recent crimes, you wouldn't question my judgment. Why is this different just because it's old?" "Because it's not about what happened then," Tom said, standing up from the railing with visible effort. "It's about what happens now, when you force people to confront things their families have spent generations trying to forget. My grandfather's dead. My father's dead. Most of the men who were adults in 1947 are dead. But their children and grandchildren are still here, still running the businesses and farms and schools that make this town work. You think they want to find out their beloved grandfather might have been involved in covering up a murder? You think that knowledge makes anyone's life better." Before Marcus could respond, headlights swept across the driveway as a dark sedan pulled in behind Tom's truck. Detective Warren emerged, looking exactly as Marcus remembered, mid-40s, with the kind of weathered competence that came from 20 years of dealing with the worst things people did to each other. She was wearing jeans and a practical jacket, her badge clipped to her belt, and her expression already cataloguing the scene, reading the tension between Marcus and Tom with the practiced eye of someone who understood immediately that she'd walked into something more complicated than old journals and historical curiosity. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice professional but not unfriendly. "Thanks for the call. I made good time." She turned to Tom, extending her hand. "Tom Brennan, right? I worked with your nephew on that vandalism case at the grain elevator 3 years back. Good kid." Tom shook her hand with the automatic courtesy that rural upbringing had ingrained, but Marcus could see the calculation behind his eyes, the way he was measuring how much cooperation to offer and where his ultimate loyalties had to land. "Detective. Didn't expect to see state police at the Mercer place. Thought this was just a renovation job." "It wasn't till about 2 hours ago," Detective Warren said, her tone suggesting she'd had this kind of conversation before. "The dance between local interests and outside authority that played out in small towns whenever uncomfortable questions got asked. Now, it's a potential investigation into a 77-year-old incident that may have been improperly handled at the time. I understand that's going to complicate some local relationships, but that's the job." She turned to Marcus, dismissing Tom as politely but firmly as someone could be dismissed without being asked to leave. "Show me what you found." Marcus led her upstairs, aware of Tom following at a distance, neither leaving nor fully participating, occupying that ambiguous space that let him maintain plausible deniability about whatever came next. The work lights Marcus had set up cast harsh shadows across the second-floor hallway, making the hole in the wall look like a wound in the building's flesh. Detective Warren pulled on latex gloves from her jacket pocket, a practiced movement that suggested she'd learned long ago to keep supplies readily available, and stepped carefully through the opening into the hidden room. Marcus watched her face as she took in the scope of what Eleanor Mercer had preserved, the systematic documentation of decades, the careful organization that suggested this wasn't random hoarding, but deliberate archive building. Detective Warren moved through the space with methodical attention, examining journals without opening them, noting the dates on spines, photographing the overall layout with her phone. When she reached the special shelf where Catherine Mercer's letter and Eleanor's 1947 journal waited, she paused for a long moment before carefully lifting the oilcloth-wrapped volume. She read the letter in silence, her expression neutral but her body language suggesting the content was hitting exactly as hard as it should. Then she opened the journal and began reading Eleanor's testimony about the night she'd witnessed the argument at the Holloway farm, the city men, and the threats and the violence that had preceded by 2 days, the fire that killed an entire family. Marcus couldn't see her face clearly from his position in the doorway, but he saw the set of her shoulders change, the way her head tilted slightly as she processed information that transformed old tragedy into potential crime scene. "This needs to be preserved properly," Detective Warren said after several minutes, her voice carrying the weight of someone making decisions that would set significant machinery in motion. "The journals, the letter, everything in this room. I'm going to need to secure this as a potential evidence site, which means the renovation work stops until we've completed a thorough examination and documentation process." From behind Marcus, Tom's voice carried quiet resignation. "How long are we talking?" Detective Warren turned to face them, still holding Eleanor's journal with careful respect. "Depends on what we find. Could be a few weeks if the journals confirm everything was handled properly in 1947 and there's no evidence of criminal activity. Could be several months if we need to cross-reference testimony with other sources, track down descendants of potential witnesses, build a comprehensive timeline of what actually happened. I won't know until we're deeper into the material. The house was supposed to be ready for sale by Christmas," Tom said, and Marcus heard in his voice all the professional complications this would create, the contracts that would need renegotiating, the timeline expectations that would be shattered, the explanations to a California nephew who'd expected a simple renovation, not a criminal investigation. "Then I guess Christmas isn't going to work," Detective Warren replied, without sympathy. "A family died under suspicious circumstances, and the investigation may have been compromised or deliberately mishandled. That takes priority over real estate schedules." Tom looked at Marcus then, and the disappointment in his face was profound enough to make Marcus want to defend his decision, to explain again why calling the detective had been the right choice, even if it was the inconvenient one. But before he could speak, Tom shook his head slowly and walked away, his footsteps heavy on the old stairs, each creaking step sounding like another brick being added to the wall that was building between them. They heard his truck start in the driveway, heard the tires on gravel as he pulled away into the October night, and then it was just Marcus and Detective Warren, standing in the harsh worklight, surrounded by decades of testimony that no one had wanted to hear. The detective continued her examination of the hidden room, photographing everything systematically, making notes on her phone, occasionally pulling out individual journals to check dates or scan brief passages. Marcus stood uselessly in the doorway, no longer a contractor working on a renovation, but a witness to something larger. Someone who'd broken through to truth and now had to watch while that truth rearranged the landscape around it. "The town's not going to like this," Marcus said eventually, breaking the silence that had stretched uncomfortable and long. Detective Warren glanced at him briefly, before returning her attention to a journal from 1952. "Towns never like it when old stories get re-examined. Too many reputations built on agreed-upon fictions. Too many family legends that only work if no one asks hard questions. But that's not my problem, Mr. Chen. My problem is figuring out what actually happened to the Holloway family and whether anyone who could have sought justice chose not to. What if the journals confirm that powerful people were involved? What if it goes all the way to the sheriff's office or the mayor at the time? Then we document it, we build the case as thoroughly as possible, and we let the facts speak for themselves, even if everyone who could be prosecuted is long dead," Detective Warren said, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd fought too many battles against institutional resistance and comfortable ignorance. "Justice doesn't have a statute of limitations on caring what's true. Sometimes all you can do is make sure the record gets corrected, that the official story stops being a lie, that the dead get their names back. It's not satisfying, Mr. Chen. It doesn't feel like enough. But it's what we can do when we get to the truth 77 years too late. Marcus thought about Eleanor Mercer, documenting truth for 40 years with exactly this hope that someday someone would care enough to make the record honest, even if they couldn't make it just. He thought about Catherine Mercer, choosing to preserve rather than destroy her mother's testimony, but lacking the courage or the energy to bring it forward herself, leaving that choice to whoever happened to break through the wall that kept truth sealed away from consequences. Outside, the October wind picked up, and through the broken windows Marcus could hear it moving through the trees that surrounded the property, branches scraping together in rhythms that sounded almost like conversation, like the land itself was commenting on what was being disturbed. After so many years of careful silence, the Victorian house creaked and settled around them, and Marcus found himself wondering what other secrets it held, what other stories had been sealed into walls, or buried under floorboards, or simply agreed to forget until everyone who remembered was safely dead. Detective Warren worked for another hour, systematically photographing and cataloguing, creating the official record that would transform Eleanor Mercer's private testimony into public evidence. When she finally finished her initial documentation, she sealed the hidden room with crime scene tape, a yellow barrier that made the discovery official, and transformed the space from architectural curiosity into active investigation site. "I'll need you to stay available," she told Marcus as they walked back downstairs, her voice carrying the automatic authority of someone used to people cooperating with investigative requirements. "There will be questions about exactly how you found the room, what you touched, what you read before calling me. Standard procedure." "I'm not going anywhere," Marcus said, which was true in the immediate sense but might not be true in the longer term, depending on how completely his relationship with Tom Brennan and the rest of Ridgemont's contracting community had been fractured by the call he'd made. After Detective Warren left, carrying with her Eleanor's special journal and Catherine's letter, both carefully bagged as evidence, Marcus sat alone in the dark Victorian, feeling the weight of choices made and consequences coming. His phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "You're off the job. We'll send final payment for work completed. Good luck finding future contracts in Jefferson County." The message was professional and blunt, exactly what Marcus had expected but hoped wouldn't come. He walked through the first floor of the Mercer place, his flashlight cutting through shadows that seemed deeper now, more accusatory, as if the house itself was judging him for exposing secrets it had protected for generations. The renovation that was supposed to be his steady income through the winter was gone, and with it, probably most of the professional reputation he'd built in this part of Washington over 3 years of good work and reliable conduct. But standing there in the darkness, surrounded by the bones of a house that had kept faith with terrible truth longer than most people kept faith with anything, Marcus found he couldn't regret the call he'd made. Eleanor Mercer had spent 40 years documenting what she'd witnessed because she believed truth mattered even when it was inconvenient. The least he could do was honor that belief by making sure her testimony finally found its audience, whatever the cost to his comfort or career. The October wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance Marcus heard the sound of the town settling in for the night, lights going on in houses where families gathered without knowing their histories were about to be re-examined, their comfortable narratives about to be complicated by questions that should have been asked 77 years ago, but were finally getting asked now. The investigation took 6 weeks to unfold, and Marcus watched it from an uncomfortable distance, no longer working on the Mercer place, but too invested in the outcome to leave Ridgemont entirely. He rented a small apartment above the hardware store on Main Street, the kind of temporary housing that came furnished with other people's cast-off furniture and the lingering smell of whoever had lived there before. His days became strange and unstructured, nothing like the purposeful rhythm of renovation work that had defined his adult life. He read, he took long walks along the country roads that stretched between failing farms and hopeful subdivisions, And he waited for phone calls from Detective Warren that came irregularly and revealed information in careful fragments. The journals told a story more complicated than simple murder, though murder was certainly part of it. Eleanor Mercer had documented not just what she'd witnessed the night before the Holloway fire, but months of context leading up to it, a careful chronicle of debt and desperation that painted a picture of rural America in the aftermath of the Great Depression and the dislocations of World War II. James Holloway had borrowed money from the wrong people, investors from Seattle who'd been buying up distressed farms throughout Jefferson County with promises of salvation that came with interest rates that guaranteed eventual default. When James had tried to organize other farmers to resist the systematic acquisition of their land, when he'd gone to the local newspaper with documentation of predatory lending practices, he'd become a problem that needed solving. The fire that killed the Holloway family hadn't been random tragedy or even heat-of-the-moment violence. It had been deliberate erasure, a message to other farmers about what happened when you fought back against forces larger than your small-town solidarity could withstand. And the subsequent investigation had been compromised from the beginning, because the sheriff at the time, a man named Robert Drummond, had himself been one of the local facilitators for the Seattle investors, someone who'd profited handsomely from steering desperate farmers toward loans they'd never escape. Detective Warren explained all this to Marcus over coffee at the town's single diner, her voice low enough not to carry to other tables, but her expression suggesting she didn't much care who overheard. The case she was building wasn't criminal in the traditional sense. Everyone directly responsible had been dead for decades, but it was historical in a way that demanded official recognition. The state planned to issue a formal acknowledgement of investigative failure, to correct the public record about how the Holloway family had died, and to name the individuals who'd been complicit in either the murders themselves or the subsequent cover-up. Drummond's grandson is the current county commissioner, Detective Warren said, watching Marcus's face for reaction. His great-nephew runs the largest real estate development firm in the region. When this becomes public, and it will become public, it's going to destroy family reputations that have been carefully maintained for 3 generations. There are people who think we should let the dead stay buried, that nothing good comes from dragging all this forward now. Marcus thought about Tom Brennan's warning on the porch, about truths that didn't heal old wounds but just opened new ones. What do you think? Detective Warren was quiet for a moment, her coffee cooling untouched between her hands. I think Eleanor Mercer spent 40 years writing everything down because she believed someone should know. I think Catherine Mercer sealed that room instead of destroying it because some part of her hoped the truth would eventually matter more than protecting comfortable lies. And I think 5 people died because they tried to resist being swallowed by forces they couldn't control. And the least we can do is make sure everyone knows their deaths weren't an accident and weren't their fault. The official announcement came in early December, released on a Friday afternoon, with the kind of timing that suggested someone hoped it would get lost in the weekend news cycle. But Ridgemont was too small and too interconnected for any story this significant to disappear quietly. By Saturday morning, the diner was full of people whose conversations stopped when Marcus entered, whose eyes tracked him with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility to something that might have been grudging respect. He ordered coffee and eggs at the counter, sat on a vinyl stool that had probably occupied this exact spot since the 1,960 seconds, and listened to the fragments of conversation that drifted from the booths behind him. People were arguing about whether the state had any business reopening investigations from before most of them were born, whether Robert Drummond's descendants deserved to have their family name dragged through public shame, whether justice that came 77 years late was justice at all, or just cruelty dressed up as moral righteousness. An older man Marcus didn't recognize slid onto the stool beside him, ordered coffee with the weary authority of someone who'd been ordering coffee at this counter for half a century, and sat in silence for a moment before speaking. "You're the contractor who found the journals." It wasn't a question, so Marcus just nodded. keeping his attention on his breakfast and wondering if this conversation was going to require defending himself or just listening to another person explain why he'd been wrong to make the call to Detective Warren. "My mother was Sarah Holloway's younger sister," the man said quietly. "She was visiting relatives in Spokane the week of the fire, which is probably the only reason she survived. She was 19 years old, and she came back to find her entire family dead and everyone in town telling her it had been a terrible accident, that James must have knocked over a lantern, that these things happened on farms and there was nothing anyone could have done. She never believed it. Spent the rest of her life saying something was wrong with the official story, that her brother-in-law was too careful with fire to make that kind of mistake, that the timing was too convenient given what James had been trying to organize among the farmers." The man paused to add sugar to his coffee, his hands shaking slightly with age or emotion or both. People treated her like she was crazy for questioning it, like her grief had made her paranoid and unstable. She died 15 years ago, still believing her family had been murdered, still angry that no one would listen. My whole life, I watched what that did to her, carrying truth no one would acknowledge, being dismissed as the woman who couldn't accept tragic accident for what it was. So whatever complications your discovery has caused, whatever reputations it's damaged, I want you to know that my family is grateful. My mother deserved to be believed. The Holloways deserved to have their story told honestly." He finished his coffee, left money on the counter, and walked out before Marcus could respond, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the conversation that had preceded it. Marcus sat with his cooling eggs, thinking about all the ways truth rippled through communities, how the same revelation that destroyed some legacies validated others, how there was no clean outcome that made everyone whole. The renovation work on the Mercer place eventually resumed, though Marcus wasn't the one doing it. Tom Brennan had hired a contractor from 2 counties over, someone with no connection to the discovery and therefore no complicated associations with how the town's history had been forcibly rewritten. Marcus heard this through the casual gossip that flowed through the hardware store, where he bought supplies he no longer needed, information delivered by the owner, who seemed to take strange satisfaction in keeping Marcus updated on the job he'd lost. But other work materialized, unexpected and tentative. A woman whose grandfather had been mentioned in Eleanor Mercer's journals as someone who'd tried to help James Holloway organize the farmers, a man who'd been marginalized in local business circles for decades because people remembered him as a troublemaker, called Marcus to ask if he'd be willing to restore the family's old dairy barn. A retired teacher who'd known Catherine Mercer hired him to renovate her kitchen, explaining that anyone Catherine had trusted with her mother's testimony was someone she could trust with her home. The work came slowly and from unlikely sources, not the steady contracting pipeline Tom Brennan had provided, but enough to justify staying in Ridgemont through the winter, enough to suggest that the town's response to what he'd done wasn't uniformly hostile. In January, the Historical Society organized a memorial service for the Holloway family, held in the same church where their funerals had been conducted 77 years earlier. Marcus attended, sitting in the back pew and watching as the community grappled with acknowledging truth that previous generations had chosen to bury. The service was complicated and awkward, full of careful language about historical injustice and the importance of correcting public records, but also full of genuine emotion from people who'd lived their entire lives not knowing their town's foundation included such deliberate cruelty. Sarah Holloway's niece, the daughter of the old man who'd spoken to Marcus at the diner, gave a brief statement thanking everyone who'd worked to bring the truth forward and expressing hope that her aunt was finally at peace, knowing her family's story had been told honestly. When she mentioned Eleanor Mercer's journals specifically, describing them as an act of courage that had preserved truth when preservation was all that was possible, Marcus felt something loosen in his chest, the tight knot of doubt about whether he'd done the right thing beginning to ease slightly. After the service, people gathered in the church basement for coffee and the kind of potluck meal that rural communities produced automatically in response to any significant emotional event. Marcus stayed on the edges, not sure if his presence was welcome or simply tolerated, until Rebecca Drummond approached him, carrying 2 paper cups of weak coffee. She was 38, a high school English teacher, and the granddaughter of Robert Drummond, the sheriff who'd helped cover up the Holloway murders. "I wanted to thank you," she said, handing him one of the coffee cups and speaking quickly, like she was worried she'd lose courage if she slowed down. "I know that sounds strange given what your discovery did to my family's reputation, but I'm grateful you made that call. My grandfather did something terrible, and my family has benefited for 3 generations from a legacy built partially on that terrible thing. We didn't know. That doesn't make us innocent exactly, but we didn't know. And now that we do know, we can choose what to do with that knowledge, how to make whatever amends are possible, how to be different going forward." She paused, looking down at her coffee. "My father hasn't spoken to me in 6 weeks. He thinks I should be defending grandfather's memory, fighting against the state's findings, protecting the family name. But I have students whose families are mentioned in those journals, kids who are learning that their great-grandfathers were victims of a corrupt system my grandfather helped maintain. How am I supposed to look at them and choose family loyalty over truth? How does anyone do that and live with themselves?" Marcus didn't have an answer that would make her burden lighter, so he just listened, understanding that sometimes all you could offer people was witness to their struggle with impossible choices. They stood together in the church basement, surrounded by the quiet conversations of a community trying to figure out how to move forward when the ground beneath them had shifted in ways that couldn't be unshifted, when comfortable stories had been replaced with complicated truths that demanded different kinds of courage than anyone had expected to need. In February, Marcus was hired by the State Historical Preservation Office to consult on the permanent archive being created from Eleanor Mercer's journals. The work was technical and oddly peaceful, helping historians understand the physical condition of the documents, advising on storage solutions that would preserve them for future researchers, contributing his contractor's knowledge to ensuring the hidden room itself was protected as a historical site. He spent long hours in the Mercer place again, but this time surrounded by academics and archivists, rather than working alone with the ghosts of other people's choices. Dr. Patricia Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, was the lead historian on the project, a specialist in rural American history who treated Eleanor's journals with the reverence usually reserved for founding documents. She explained to Marcus how rare it was to have such comprehensive documentation from ordinary people living through the Depression and war years, how Eleanor's compulsive record-keeping had inadvertently created one of the most complete pictures of rural Washington life during that period that existed anywhere. "The Holloway material is obviously significant," Dr. Chen said, as they worked together to stabilize journals whose bindings had begun to fail. "But the real treasure is everything else. All the daily documentation of farm life and community dynamics, the way Eleanor captured how economic forces and political decisions filtered down to individual families. Historians will be studying these journals for decades, using them to understand how national trends played out in specific local contexts." Marcus thought about Eleanor Mercer, writing every night after farm work was done, documenting her life with a thoroughness that must have seemed obsessive to anyone who knew about it. She couldn't have imagined her private journals becoming primary historical sources, couldn't have known that her careful attention to daily detail would eventually matter to people who'd never heard of Ridgemont or Jefferson County. She'd just been trying to make sense of her world, to preserve truth because letting it disappear felt like another form of violence against people who'd already suffered too much. In March, when the last snow was melting from the fields and the early crocuses were pushing up through soil that was just beginning to warm, Marcus drove out to the old Holloway property. The land had changed ownership multiple times since 1947, been subdivided and sold off in pieces, transformed from working farm to hobby acreage to eventually nothing but empty fields that no one had figured out how to profitably use. The house foundation was still visible if you knew where to look, a rectangle of blackened stone and old ash that grass had never quite managed to colonize completely. He stood there for a long time, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the spot where 5 people had died because they'd tried to resist forces larger than their individual courage could overcome. The March wind moved across the empty fields, carrying the scent of wet earth and possibility, that particular smell of land preparing itself for another growing season, for whatever would be planted or left fallow, for continuation regardless of what had come before. Marcus thought about all the choices that had led to this moment, his decision to make the call to Detective Warren, Eleanor's decision to document what she'd witnessed, Catherine's decision to preserve rather than destroy, the Holloway's decision to fight back against predatory systems, even when fighting back carried existential risk. None of them had known how their choices would ripple forward through time, what consequences would emerge from actions taken in good faith or desperation or stubborn belief that truth mattered even when truth was inconvenient. His phone buzzed with a text from Detective Warren, letting him know the official report was being published the following week, that there would likely be more media attention, that he should be prepared for renewed interest in his role in the discovery. Marcus typed back a brief acknowledgement, pocketed the phone, and continued standing in the field where ghosts demanded nothing from him except that he remember they'd existed, that their lives had mattered, that their deaths hadn't been the accident everyone had agreed to believe. When he finally returned to his truck, the sun was dropping toward the tree line, painting the sky in colors that spoke of transitions and temporary beauty, of days ending and others waiting to begin. Marcus drove back into Ridgemont as lights were coming on in houses, families gathering for dinner, the ordinary rhythms of small-town life continuing around and through the complicated history that had been forcibly brought forward into present consciousness. He passed the Mercer place, saw lights on inside where the archival team was still working, preserving Eleanor's testimony for future generations who would draw their own conclusions about what it all meant. What responsibilities they carried for injustices committed by people they'd never met, but whose choices had shaped the world they inherited. The Victorian house stood solid against the darkening sky, no longer abandoned or shameful, but transformed into something like monument, a physical reminder that truth could survive when preservation was all that was possible, when speaking aloud was too dangerous, but writing in private at least created the possibility that someday someone would care enough to listen. Marcus thought about his father, about their last argument, and the accusation that running away to swing hammers was just avoiding real responsibility. He wondered what his father would make of this, whether forcing an entire community to confront its buried history counted as the kind of significance his father had always insisted mattered more than craftsmanship or restoration. He suspected his father would find some way to criticize even this, to suggest that Marcus had stumbled into importance rather than choosing it deliberately, that accidental virtue didn't count the same as intentional moral action. But standing in the March twilight, watching the town settle into evening, Marcus found he didn't need his father's validation or anyone else's. He'd made the choice that honored Eleanor Mercer's 40 years of documentation, that gave the Holloway family truth instead of comfortable fiction, that insisted the dead deserved better than expedient amnesia. The choice had cost him work and reputation and the easy life he'd been building in this part of Washington. But it had also given him something harder to name, a sense that he'd been present for a moment when preservation meant more than saving old buildings, when restoration wasn't about returning things to their original condition, but about recovering truth that had been deliberately obscured. He parked outside his apartment above the hardware store, climbed the narrow stairs to the space that still didn't feel quite like home, and stood at the window, looking out at Main Street, where a few people were still moving between the diner and the grocery store and the bar that had occupied the same corner since 1923. This was Ridgemont, complicated and flawed, and trying imperfectly to reckon with history that previous generations had chosen to bury. The town would survive this reckoning the way it had survived economic collapse and war, and the slow erosion of rural life under pressure from forces no one could entirely control. And somewhere in the preserved journals that would outlast everyone currently living, Eleanor Mercer's voice would continue bearing witness to what she'd seen, offering future readers the gift and burden of knowing that truth, once documented, became impossible to permanently suppress, that someone would eventually care enough to break through whatever walls were built to contain it. Marcus had been that someone, not because he was brave or particularly virtuous, but because he'd been holding a sledgehammer when the wall gave way, because preservation work sometimes meant discovering what needed. Preserving wasn't just the building, but the testimony the building contained. The March night settled over Ridgemont, with the weight of history acknowledged but not resolved, with legacies complicated and family stories rewritten, and the land continuing its patient witness to everything human beings did on its surface and tried to bury beneath. Marcus stood at his window until the street below was dark, except for scattered porch lights and the glow from the bar's neon sign, then finally turned away, made coffee he didn't really want, and sat with the complicated satisfaction of knowing he'd done something that mattered, even if he'd never fully understand all the ways it mattered or to whom. The land remembered everything, even when people chose to forget. And sometimes, if you were willing to listen carefully enough, if you were willing to honor the testimony of those who'd preserved truth when preservation was all they could manage, the land would give back what it had been forced to hold in silence, would release its secrets into present consciousness, and demand that the living find courage to acknowledge what the dead had tried so desperately to tell them. Marcus had been the instrument of that release, and whatever came next, whatever work he found or didn't find, whatever reputation he rebuilt or failed to rebuild, he would carry forward the knowledge that when the moment had arrived requiring choice between convenience and truth, he'd chosen truth and let the consequences arrange themselves however they needed to. Outside his window, Ridgemont slept uneasily, and the fields beyond town limits absorbed the March rain that was just beginning to fall, the earth accepting water the way it accepted everything, patient and indifferent and eternal, ready for whatever would be planted when spring finally arrived in full. By May, the archive was complete, and the Mercer place had been officially designated as a state historical site, its hidden room preserved exactly as Marcus had found it, journals carefully stored in climate-controlled facilities, but photographed and digitized so researchers could access Eleanor's testimony without risking further deterioration of the fragile originals. The Victorian house itself would become a museum and educational center, its restoration finally moving forward under the oversight of the Historical Preservation Office, with funding that dwarfed anything Catherine Mercer's nephew could have invested in a simple sale. Marcus stood in what had been the second-floor hallway, watching workers install protective glass panels that would allow visitors to see into the hidden room without entering it, to witness the space where truth had waited in darkness for someone to care enough to bring it forward. The hole he'd made with his sledgehammer had been carefully preserved, left rough and unfinished as part of the story, a reminder that discovery often came through breaking rather than gentle revelation, that sometimes you had to damage carefully constructed walls before you could understand what they'd been built to contain. Dr. Patricia Chen found him there, carrying a leather folder that Marcus recognized as one of Eleanor's journals from the early 1972, near the end of her documentation period. "Thought you'd want to see this," she said, opening the journal to a page she'd marked with a strip of acid-free paper. "It's one of the last entries Eleanor made, dated October 1976, about 6 months before she died." Marcus took the journal carefully, his hands now practiced at handling materials that required gentle respect, and read the passage Dr. Chen had marked. Eleanor's handwriting was shakier than in earlier journals, the tremor of age or illness making the words harder to decipher, but the voice was unmistakable, still carrying that same clarity and moral certainty that had characterized 40 years of testimony. I am 73 years old, and my hands shake when I write, and my daughter keeps telling me I should rest instead of filling these pages with words no one will ever read. But I find I cannot stop, cannot abandon the habit of documentation that has shaped my life since I was a young woman trying to make sense of a world that seemed determined to reward cruelty and punish resistance. I do not know if anyone will ever care about what I witnessed that night in 1947, if anyone will believe that the Holloway family deserved better than the convenient fiction we all agreed to accept. But I write it down anyway, preserve it as carefully as I know how, because the alternative is letting truth die with me, and that feels like another form of violence against people who have already suffered too much. The passage continued for another page, Eleanor reflecting on her life and the choices she'd made, the things she regretted and the few things she felt certain about. She wrote about her marriage to Thomas, who died in 1963 and had never entirely understood her compulsion to document everything, but had loved her anyway. She wrote about Catherine, her only child, brilliant and careful, and perhaps too aware of how the world punished people who insisted on uncomfortable truths. And she wrote about the land itself, the fields she'd worked for decades, the way the seasons continued regardless of human drama, the way wheat grew and cattle fattened and time moved forward with patient indifference to individual suffering. The land remembers everything we try to forget, Eleanor had written in that shaky hand. It holds our secrets and our shame, our courage and our cowardice, everything we were when no one was watching. We think we can bury the past deep enough that it stops mattering, but the land knows better. The land waits with the patience of something that will outlast all our careful forgetting, and eventually it gives back what we tried to hide. I will not live to see whether these journals ever find their audience, but I trust that the land will keep them safe until someone breaks through to truth, until someone cares enough to listen to what I tried so hard to preserve. Marcus closed the journal carefully, feeling the weight of prophecy fulfilled, the way Eleanor's trust in eventual revelation had been justified by his accidental discovery nearly 40 years after her death. Dr. Chen watched him with the patient attention of someone who'd spent months studying these journals and understood their emotional complexity in ways casual readers never would. She was right about everything, Dr. Chen said quietly. The land did keep her testimony safe. Someone did care enough to listen. And the truth she preserved is changing how we understand not just what happened to the Holloway family, but how power operated in rural communities during that period, how institutional corruption functioned, how ordinary people resisted or accommodated or documented when resistance seemed impossible. The workers behind them continued installing the protective glass, their tools and movements creating a background rhythm that felt appropriate for this conversation, the sound of preservation work that honored rather than concealed, that made visible instead of burying deeper. Marcus thought about all the ways this project had unfolded, how his simple renovation job had become something far more significant than anyone could have anticipated, how breaking through one wall had led to breaking through decades of carefully maintained silence. In June, Tom Brennan called him for the first time since their confrontation on the porch back in October, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd spent months reconsidering positions he'd once held with certainty. They met at the diner, sat across from each other in a booth that had probably witnessed 1,000 difficult conversations over the decades it had been serving coffee and mediocre eggs to Ridgemont's residents. Tom looked older than Marcus remembered, or maybe just more tired, the weight of watching his community fragment over questions of truth and loyalty having taken visible toll. "I owe you an apology," Tom said after they'd ordered, the words coming slowly like he'd practiced them, but they still didn't feel natural. "I was wrong about keeping the past buried. Not completely wrong about the complications it would cause, those were real enough, but wrong about whether those complications justified letting lies stand as official record. My grandfather knew the Holloways, considered James a friend, and he spent 50 years living with the knowledge that his friend had been murdered and no one who could have sought justice chose to do it. That weight damaged him in ways I only understand now, seeing what the truth has done for people who'd been carrying similar burdens. Marcus accepted the apology with a nod, understanding that some rifts couldn't be completely healed, but could at least be acknowledged and carefully bridged. The work you gave me those 3 years, it mattered. Taught me things about this kind of community that I couldn't have learned anywhere else. I'm sorry it ended the way it did. Yeah, well, Tom said, attempting something like a smile that didn't quite succeed. Maybe it didn't end so much as change direction. That dairy barn project you're working on, the one for the Steinberg family, they mentioned they might need help with their farmhouse once the barn is finished. I told them you were reliable, that you understood how to work with historic structures without destroying what made them valuable. Figured that was the least I could do. The gesture was small but significant, an acknowledgement that professional relationships in places like Ridgemont were complicated by layers of history and obligation that outsiders could never fully navigate, but that goodwill still counted for something when people chose to extend it. They finished their coffee talking about neutral topics, construction techniques and material suppliers, and the challenges of finding skilled labor in rural areas, rebuilding, if not quite the friendship they'd had before then, at least the foundation for future cooperation. July brought the official opening of the Eleanor Mercer Historical Center, a ceremony that drew visitors from across the state and national media coverage that transformed Ridgemont briefly into a focal point for conversations about historical justice and institutional accountability. The governor gave a speech acknowledging the state's failure to properly investigate the Holloway deaths in 1947 and praising Eleanor's courage in documenting truth when documentation was all that was possible. Rebecca Drummond spoke about the complicated legacy of being descended from people who'd done terrible things, about choosing truth over comfortable family mythology, about the responsibility each generation carried to be better than those who came before. Marcus attended but stayed in the back, uncomfortable with the attention that kept finding him, despite his preference for working quietly and letting the project speak for itself. Reporters wanted to interview him about the moment of discovery, about what he'd felt breaking through that wall, about whether he'd known immediately that he'd found something significant. He gave brief, factual answers that satisfied no one but protected his privacy, maintained the boundaries between his role in this story and the story itself, which belonged to Eleanor and Catherine and the Holloways and everyone in Ridgemont who'd chosen courage over convenience once they knew the truth. Sarah Holloway's niece, whose name was Margaret and who was 79 years old now, came up to Marcus after the ceremony, moving slowly with a cane but with clear purpose in her direction. She took his hand in both of hers, her skin paper-thin and spotted with age, her grip surprisingly strong. "My aunt would have liked you," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the emotion Marcus could see in her eyes. She spent her whole life insisting the official story was wrong, and people treated her like she was crazy or bitter or unable to accept tragedy for what it was. Died still fighting to be believed, still angry that her family had been erased by convenient lies. You gave her vindication 77 years too late to do her any good, but her children and grandchildren know now that she was right, that her grief wasn't paranoia, that everything she insisted about that night was true. That matters more than you probably understand. Marcus found he couldn't speak past the tightness in his throat, so he just held her hands and nodded, accepting the weight of gratitude he hadn't entirely earned, but that belonged to him anyway, by virtue of being the person who'd swung the sledgehammer at the right moment, who'd made the call when calling meant choosing complication over ease. August was harvest month, the fields around Ridgemont turning gold with wheat that had somehow survived a dry spring and uncertain summer to produce yields that gave farmers hope for manageable winters ahead. Marcus drove the back roads between jobs, watching combines move through fields in patterns that had been repeated for generations, the mechanical efficiency of modern agriculture overlaid on landscapes that had been farmed for more than a century. The land continued its patient witness to human drama, accepting whatever was planted or left fallow, producing abundance or scarcity according to rhythms that had nothing to do with individual virtue or community righteousness. He found himself thinking about Eleanor Mercer's observation that the land remembered everything people tried to forget, that it held truth with patient indifference until someone was ready to receive it. The Holloway property where 5 people had died was still empty, still just fields that no one had figured out how to profitably use. But the Historical Society had placed a marker there now, a simple stone monument that named the family and acknowledged the circumstances of their deaths with honesty that had been denied for 77 years. It wasn't justice in any meaningful sense, but it was truth, and truth had its own value, independent of whether it came with consequences or accountability. In September, as the tourist season ended and Ridgemont returned to its ordinary rhythms, Marcus accepted a long-term project restoring a farmhouse that had been in the same family since the 1892, a structure whose bones were solid but whose systems had been neglected past the point where simple repairs would suffice. The work would take him through winter and into the following spring, steady employment that suggested his reputation had survived the complications of the Mercer discovery, that people in this community had decided he could be trusted with their family homes and their historical structures, despite, or perhaps because of, his willingness to honor truth over convenience. The farmhouse sat on a ridge overlooking the valley where Ridgemont occupied its small portion of landscape, and from the second-floor windows Marcus could see the Mercer place in the distance, its Victorian silhouette distinctive against the tree line. He thought about Eleanor working her fields and writing her journals, about Catherine making the difficult choice to preserve rather than destroy, about all the moments of courage or cowardice that had led to truth being sealed in darkness until someone accidentally broke through to it. On a Friday evening in late September, as the light was turning golden and the temperature was dropping toward the kind of cold that made you think about winter preparations, Marcus drove out to visit the Holloway Memorial. He'd been meaning to go since the dedication ceremony back in July, but had kept putting it off, unsure what he hoped to find or accomplish by standing in an empty field looking at a stone marker. But something pulled him there as autumn settled over the landscape. Some need to complete a circle that had begun with his sledgehammer breaking through a wall and led through months of complication to this moment of quiet acknowledgement. The stone was simple granite, local material that would weather the decades the way everything in this landscape weathered, with patient erosion that eventually reduced all human monuments to their essential elements. The inscription gave names and dates and a brief statement acknowledging that James, Sarah, and their 3 children had been murdered in a fire deliberately set to silence James's resistance to predatory business practices. No elaborate language, no poetry, just truth stated plainly enough that anyone reading it would understand that these deaths hadn't been accidental and hadn't been forgotten, even if justice had come too late to matter in any practical sense. Marcus stood there as the September sun dropped toward the horizon, painting the sky in colors that reminded him of transformation and temporary beauty, of endings that were also beginnings if you were willing to see them that way. The wind moved across the empty fields, carrying the scent of wheat, stubble, and dry grass, that particular smell of land preparing itself for winter, for the dormancy that preceded spring's renewal. He thought about Eleanor's 40 years of documentation, about Catherine's choice to seal truth away rather than destroy it, about his own accidental role in bringing forward testimony that had waited patiently for someone to care enough to listen. The land remembered everything, just as Eleanor had written. It held secrets and witnessed choices, and continued its patient existence, regardless of whether humans acknowledged or concealed, or eventually revealed the truth of what had happened on its surface. Marcus had learned during his months in Ridgemont that preservation work sometimes meant more than saving old buildings, that restoration could apply to historical records and family reputations and community understanding of its own past. The work was messier than structural repairs, couldn't be accomplished with skilled hands, and good intentions alone required courage that had nothing to do with physical strength and everything to do with being willing to honor truth, even when truth complicated comfortable narratives. He returned to his truck as darkness settled over the valley, drove back toward town with the radio playing softly and the heater beginning to work against the September chill. Ridgemont appeared ahead, lights coming on in houses and businesses, the ordinary evening rituals of a small town that had survived its confrontation with buried history and would continue surviving whatever came next. The community had been changed by what Marcus had discovered, made more aware of its own capacity for both courage and cowardice, forced to acknowledge that the land they'd inherited came with responsibilities to truth that previous generations had shirked. But it had also demonstrated resilience, the ability to absorb difficult revelations and adjust narratives and continue functioning even when the ground beneath comfortable assumptions had been disturbed. People still farmed their fields and ran their businesses and raised their children, incorporating new understanding of the past into present lives without being paralyzed by guilt or anger, or the complications that came from knowing their town's history included deliberate cruelty and institutional failure. Marcus thought about his father's old accusation about running away to swing hammers, about avoiding real responsibility in favor of work that was satisfying but ultimately insignificant. He wondered what his father would make of this year, whether forcing historical reckoning counted as the kind of meaningful engagement his father had always insisted mattered more than craftsmanship. He suspected his father would find some way to diminish even this, to suggest that accidental virtue wasn't the same as intentional moral action, that stumbling into significance didn't demonstrate character so much as luck. But standing in that field at the Holloway Memorial, watching the September light paint the landscape in shades of gold and amber, Marcus had felt something that had nothing to do with his father's approval or anyone else's judgment about the value of his choices. He'd felt connected to something larger than individual accomplishment, part of a continuum that stretched from Eleanor's patient documentation through Catherine's difficult preservation to his own accidental discovery and forward into whatever future researchers and visitors would make of the testimony that had finally found its audience. The land continued, and the stories continued, and the work of honoring truth continued even when truth came without justice, even when all you could do was make sure the record was honest, and the dead were remembered accurately, and the living understood that every generation carried responsibility for being better than those who came before. Marcus drove through Ridgemont's quiet streets, past the Mercer, a place with its lights still on, where evening visitors were touring the museum, past the diner and the hardware store and the bar that had witnessed decades of the town's private dramas and public celebrations. He returned to his apartment above the hardware store, climbed the narrow stairs to the space that had gradually become home, despite never being quite what he'd imagined when he'd first arrived in this community. Through his window he could see Main Street settling into night, the few remaining lights creating small islands of illumination in the larger darkness. Somewhere in the distance, the fields waited for whatever would be planted or left fallow when spring arrived, the land accepting everything with patient indifference, holding truth and lies with equal grip until someone cared enough to distinguish between them. Marcus made coffee and sat at the window, watching Ridgemont breathe through its evening rhythms, thinking about Eleanor Mercer and the Holloway family and everyone who'd chosen courage or cowardice when the choice mattered. The work continued, restoration and preservation, and the patient effort to honor truth, even when truth came complicated and difficult, and decades too late to prevent the harm it documented. But that was the work, Marcus understood now. Not making everything right, but making sure nothing stayed buried so deep it stopped mattering, ensuring that the land gave back what it had been forced to hold in silence, trusting that someone would eventually care enough to listen when testimony finally found its voice. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.